Several times on this podcast, we've covered the tension associated with regulatory requirements that are intended to force the transition to lower logistics related emissions. We talked about the federal emissions reduction program started under the Biden administration and the lawsuit brought by the state of Nebraska against California's Advanced Clean Fleets rule, which would have forced any fleet entering the state to lower their emissions. I even had the opportunity to speak with Nebraska Attorney General Mike Hilgers about the state's victory in that case based on California's decision to withdraw their waiver application from the EPA. As you've probably read in the news, the Trump administration has rolled back many of those state level programs, taking a position not necessarily against EVs, but against mandated transitions. Now, California always plays a unique role in these debates. They have the most air pollution in the country, but they also have the toughest emissions regulations. The California Air Resources Board predates the EPA. And so in the past, that has allowed them to make their own rules, only needing to get waivers when their standards are actually tougher than what the federal government requires. But on May 22nd, the Senate voted to strip California of some waivers. And these waivers would have allowed it to have tougher standards than the feds. They were using those waivers to impose tough standards on trucks with heavy duty engines and to mandate the sales of zero emission heavy duty trucks. Most specifically, and affecting more individuals, the Senate voted to nullify a 2022 measure that would have banned the sale of new gas powered cars by 2035. Now, because of these changes, the state of California doesn't have the same ability it previously did to address the emissions from passenger cars as well as the heavy duty trucks that we think being part of our supply chains. The California Air Resources Board has said that it plans to fight back, but that could take years, according to CARB Chair Leanne Randolph. Now, California may be down, but they are certainly not out. They are trying some new and creative ways of regulating the emissions from logistics. So, in this episode of Art of Supply, I'm going to introduce you to the Warehouse Actions and Investments to Reduce Emissions, known as WAIRE, and the Warehouse Indirect Source Rule. We'll talk about how these rules are intended to work and how they're being enforced. And then I think it's important to consider before we're done whether this alternative approach will be effective in achieving its objectives. So, what exactly is an indirect source rule? These rules regulate the emissions from vehicles operating at warehouses. Now, we just talked about the fact that the Senate rolled back California's ability to regulate the vehicles themselves. And here's where we get the indirect part. It doesn't apply directly to fleet owners, it applies to the warehouses and shopping malls and other large facilities they stop at. So it's a different approach. Rather than setting emissions standards, which would be directly related to the vehicles themselves, this is an air regulation, which is related to specific facilities. The indirect source rule is currently in the fourth year of a 5-year phase in. And the biggest change in this fourth year is that it now applies to warehouses with 100,000 square feet or more. The rule started with the largest warehouses in the state, and it has been slowly working its way down. Now we're hitting a size of square footage where a lot more smaller operation warehouses are being affected. Interestingly, the Wall Street Journal in some of its coverage described this rule as obscure. And yet I have a feeling we're going to start hearing about more of these. So indirect source rules are implemented specifically by local air districts. So we're looking at it within the state of California, but it's relegated right now to a specific district. These districts tend to have a lot of warehouses, shopping malls, even ports, places that have a lot of trucks coming and going. Because most tailpipe emissions regulations are covered by federal law, having these local air districts creates a more contained space where different rules can legally be put into action. Warehouse owners and operators are required to calculate the number of truck trips their operations generate. They can earn points to offset any of these pollution causing activities. And examples include putting in incentives to get zero emission trucks to come to their facility, installing solar panels, putting in EV chargers. If they don't have enough points to offset all of their pollution causing activity, yes, they pay fees to make up for the rest. Now, specifically in California, with this indirect source rule, we're looking at the South Coast Air Quality Management District. They have implemented and are enforcing this indirect source rule. This agency covers all of Orange County, the non desert portions of Los Angeles, as well as Riverside and San Bernardino counties. Now, in that area, you have two major ports, Los Angeles and Long Beach, California. So, even having an indirect source rule that is contained to this one district is going to have a huge impact on logistics costs. So, the very largest warehouses that they started with, 250,000 square feet and above, had to start filing their reports by the end of January 2023. So, this is where we go through the multi year rollout. In 2024, that expanded to include warehouses that were between 150,000 and that 250,000 square foot size. Facilities between 100,000 and 150 had to have their initial site information report filed by last year and their first annual report by the end of January of this year. So now that we're getting down into these smaller warehouses, there are a couple of different issues. Certainly, it's affecting more facilities, but it's also starting to affect facilities that don't have the deep pockets that the larger facilities did. Now, there is some really scary math associated with this rule. Just bear with me on this. It's much better in writing. Check out the Art of Procurement article or my LinkedIn newsletter if you want to see the details. But just to give you a sense of how they're calculating the polluting activity that needs to be offset. The first big thing is they're not actually tracked because it's the air district. They're estimated. And the calculation is something called WATTs, weighted annual truck trips. You have class 2B to 7 trucks. Those are calculated. But class 8, your traditional tractor trailer, the emissions from those are escalated 2.5 times. So you add up all of those emissions, and then you plug that into a second formula, the WAIRE points compliance obligation. That's where you take your watts, your weighted annual truck trips, and multiply it times an annual variable and a stringency factor. Simple math, right? So because they can't directly measure the emissions, they have to come up with these complex ways of trying to estimate what they are. So we've talked about the offsets, but we haven't necessarily talked about the fees. If they don't have enough points to offset all of the pollution, they can buy basically waivers. Each point that they have to pay to offset instead of earning through other investment costs $1,000. Now, there's already been some serious money moving associated with the indirect source rule. To date, California has collected $1.3 million simply in penalties for late filings. There have been 220 citations to get them to that $1.3 million figure. And the fees themselves have been worth a whole lot more, $54 million since this all started to take effect. Now, these indirect source rules represent a change in emissions regulation philosophy, let's call it. So the whole incentive structure and the pressure associated has changed. California can no longer force people to buy certain kinds of trucks. They can't force them to have a certain mix of vehicles in their fleet. But they figure they can put pressure on the organizations that do business with those traditional truck fleet operators. As I've said, this applies to certainly warehouses, but also rail yards, ports, anywhere that has the square footage and that has these trucks coming and going. According to an article published by the Union of Concerned Scientists, quote, unlike state regulations that set clean air standards for vehicles and engines, more stringent than federal standards, indirect source rules do not require approval from the Environmental Protection Agency. So, this is where California has found an indirect and creative way to actually start achieving what they wanted to do, but that the EPA had the ability to push them back on. And it's not just California. New York's Clean Deliveries Act contains some wording that starts to get close to putting one of these in place for them. And there's an interesting phrase in that act. It talks about the quote, pollution they facilitate and attract. To me, that wording makes it sound like the government is implying that these warehouses and other locations are being intentionally nefarious about emissions. Now, the other interesting thing is the split of responsibility. A lot of times, warehouses are operated by different companies and groups of people that own them. So the owner has some level of responsibility, even if a third party is operating that facility. But then the operators also have responsibility because if the ownership of the facility and the operation of the facility are separate, the owner doesn't necessarily have any way of knowing how many of what kind of truck is coming and going. So it's forcing the ownership structure and the contracts that are in place for leases to shift to accommodate this. Some warehouses even have multiple tenants, which is making it even harder and therefore more of an administrative overhead to meet these requirements. Now, as you might imagine, advocacy groups are thrilled. So while you have the warehouse owners and the fleet owners and even chambers of commerce being very concerned about the impact of these rules, environmental advocacy groups are absolutely celebrating their effect. There's a group called Earth Justice, and they tie the indirect source rule to the expansion of e-commerce and the increasing number of large warehouses that are being built to get us all of the things that we buy online. They're celebrating California's rule and pushing for a similar rule in New York. As one of the articles on their site says, quote, when it comes to air pollution, states routinely regulate facilities like power plants and factories that emit air pollution directly. By contrast, the air pollution associated with warehouses is not from the facility itself, but from the trucks and other traffic indirectly associated with their operations. For this reason, a warehouse is an indirect source of air pollution. These facilities are generally unregulated, and ISR is therefore a critical tool for states to be able to address these emissions. Now, when I think about how that sounds, and I think back to the idea of attracting these vehicles, right? It actually reminds me a little bit of the movement we've seen in other industries to unbank people that you don't agree with. So it sounds like at least this environmental advocacy group doesn't like the infrastructure changes that have resulted from the explosion of e-commerce. And they're saying that everybody playing any part in that should bear some responsibility. Now, I do think it's fair to point out, and this is where we start to get into questioning some of the objectives and how effective these rules are going to be, keeping in mind that they're not actually tracking emissions, they're just estimating them. These activist groups assume that emissions will be lowered in response to things like the indirect source rule, or at least that solar panels will be installed, EV chargers will be installed, zero emissions trucks will be incentivized to come in. But what if owners and operators do the math and simply decide it's a better practice to pay the fees? There's a firm called Grow, GROWE, and it pairs 3PLs with companies that are looking for shipping providers. As they wrote in an explanatory article about these indirect source rules on their blog, quote, in plain English, these are tax rules being implemented to reduce carbon emissions and air pollution. But unfortunately, that means 3PL owners are picking up the tab. And there really are high estimated costs associated with this. For warehouse operators, this rule may cost an additional 80 cents to dollar per square foot. And when you think about the hundreds of thousands of square feet in a warehouse, that really does add up. And that's in addition to the administrative workload associated with all of the reporting. Now, my question, and one that I didn't get a great answer to in my reading, is what's happening to all of the funds being collected through these fees? So there's the $54 million dollars that have been paid in fees, and there's the $1.3 million dollars in late fees that have been collected. One manufacturer of EV yard trucks is Orange EV, and they do have a reference on their site that talks about the fees being used to create purchase incentives for zero emission trucks, to create purchase incentives for charging infrastructure, and warehouse operators, and you would like to think 3PLs, can actually apply for these funds as soon as they're available. But as with all government programs, like we talk about in the CHIPS and Science Act, for example, there are always restrictions. In this case, one of the examples that they talk about is that the credits can only be earned through the use of this funded equipment. So you couldn't necessarily use the funds to put in an EV charger, but you could use the funds to pay for the electricity that's distributed through it. So they're trying to make sure that companies aren't just saying, fine, buy a bunch of solar panels and put them on the roof and don't plug them in. That's less expensive than buying the offset points. They're trying to make sure that these things are actually being used. But it's very difficult, it sounds like, to get this money distributed to you. And so, once again, I wonder, is it all just sitting in a bank account somewhere, or has it been distributed? Now, clearly, agencies like the South Coast Air Quality Management District do have the legal ability to establish and enforce these indirect source rules. And because of that, at least in this district and in other districts where they're created, like New York, as we've talked about, warehouse owners, operators, and 3PLs are going to have to figure out the optimal way to handle these added costs because they are added costs from the reporting through the investments that can be made to earn points or through the fees that have to be paid to buy the points. Those fees end up being passed along to every single consumer. And especially given the volume of freight entering the United States through the ports at Long Beach and Los Angeles, the cost impact is widespread. So there are still some questions about whether this is going to drive the intended activity, but you really do have to admire the creativity of it. California is clearly determined to drive down emissions, and regulations are their chosen method. Once the full rule takes effect and those annual fees start to be due, I have a feeling the cost impact is going to be anything but indirect.